Once among the most densely populated spaces in the world, the Kowloon Walled City, across the water from Hong Kong Island, was one of history's greatest anomalies, where over the centuries, what was once a Qing dynasty fortress used to keep an eye on the interference of the British Empire was transformed into a lawless collection of tightly packed tenement blocks and criminal elements, creating a den of drug peddlers, addicts, pimps and prostitutes that openly flouted successive governments. Preceding the Walled City, what would eventually form its basis, was first established under the Song dynasty in around 1080 AD, where, during the reign of Emperor Huizong, an outpost was established on the beach of the recently established settlement of Kowloon, which was used to manage the trade of salt that was being exported from the Chinese mainland to destinations including Hong Kong Island itself and the various other island colonies of the early Chinese Empire, salt being a major commodity during the 11th century, as visionary Grand Chancellor and contemporary economist Wang Anshi, through his controversial state policies known as the New Policies, expanded the rural economy of China with salt crop loans in order to reduce social inequality by bringing farmers into the commercial economy. For the next 6 centuries, the outpost would remain largely unchanged until 1668, when it was first fortified as a signal station and operated by a guard of 30 men, followed in 1810 by its formal establishment as one of the main coastal defence stations for Hong Kong after the abandonment of the 16th century Tonglung Fort, located on the island of Tonglung Chau, and sits at the mouth of Hong Kong Harbour, and thus what was described as a small but miserable structure was built on the beach overlooking Kowloon Bay, maintaining a somewhat insignificant strategic and administrative position in the wider scheme of Chinese politics. The situation would change dramatically, though, following the end of the First Opium War, a series of military skirmishes and battles which took place between the forces of the Qing dynasty, under the Daoyang Emperor, and the Royal Navy of the British Empire, the cause of which was due to disputes over the legalization and taxation of the opium trade from Imperial China, thus resulting in a conflict fought primarily at sea between Chinese war junks and technologically superior Royal Navy steam-powered warships, the defeat of the Chinese imperial factions, and with British forces poised to attack the dynastic capital of Nanking, leading to a treaty being negotiated aboard the ship of the line HMS Cornwallis on August 29, 1842, during which the island of Hong Kong was ceded to the British Empire as a crown colony. With the treaty ratified in 1843, Hong Kong was exchanged on June 26th of that year, and the fortress at Kowloon was expanded greatly to serve as the administrative centre for 491 villages in the surrounding region, as well as being made the seat of the Commodore of Taiping, the chief military officer of the county, and a garrison to 150 men, with an appraisal of the fort's defences eventually requiring that the structure be rebuilt in order to suitably defend against any potential assault by British forces now stationed across the water on Hong Kong Island. These works, which were outlined by Qi Ying, the Governor-General of Guangdong and Guangxi, demanding the construction of a walled city upon which were mounted cannons, together with offices and barracks that would not only provide accommodation for civil and military personnel, but also be used for drills and other military functions, the resulting Kowloon Walled City being completed in 1847. Built of granite ashlar facing that was 15 feet wide and 13 feet high, the wall was 700 feet by 400 feet in a shape resembling a parallelogram, and enclosed an area of 6.5 acres, surrounded by 6 watchtowers and 4 gateways, which featured doors made of wood lined with iron sheetings, the official main gate of the fortress being the south gate, above which were displayed the 4 characters Chu Lung Sai Cheng. Although due to the east gate directly accessing Kowloon's bustling market, this was the entranceway which saw the most traffic, a later extension of the wall at the northern corner resulting in an additional triangular apex which sat below Twin Phoenix Hill. In 1854, under an anti-dynastic rebellion led by Chinese revolutionary Hong Ziquan, who proclaimed himself to be the brother of Jesus Christ, rebel forces, taking advantage of a general disturbance being caused by the wider Taiping rebellion, launched an assault on the walled city from across the harbour and captured it, the fortress being occupied primarily by Hakka stoneworkers and members of the underground criminal organisation, the Triads, who initially promised a peaceful running of the city, before later ransacking it for all its worthy goods, with all animals, including pigs, poultry and dogs, being seized for food, the rebels holding the walled city for 4 weeks, before 9 war junks carrying 2,000 imperial soldiers launched an assault from the harbour and retook the fortress. By 1898, the garrison of the walled city numbered 544 men, with around 200 civilians also living within its walls, these being primarily the wives and children of serving officers and troops, And while there had generally been a peace between the British and Chinese forces since the end of the Second Opium War in 1860, with the military forces of both factions helping to maintain general law and order in Hong Kong and Kowloon, the officers in charge of the walled city remained highly sceptical of what were perceived to be the Western intruders in their country, and thus created within the walls of the garrison an entirely self-sustained community, which would be sheltered from the decadent influence of the British Empire, leading to the establishment of the Lun Chin Communal School, which would maintain the moral standards as observed by the Qing dynasty. The school being built of blue-baked bricks on a granite foundation and comprised 2 main halls and 2 courtyards akin to the grander ancestral halls of the new territories, with local tutors and literary figures being elected to the school board each year, and funding provided from various, though irregular, sources, eventually resulting in a donation being made during the 1880s, whereby a special rate was levied on the sale of suckling pig meat, the proceeds of which would help subsidize the school's operation. The situation in China remained mostly peaceful until 1894, when, following raised tensions between the Qing government and the Japanese Empire, primarily over the influence each nation had on the strategically vital Korean peninsula, the 8-month First Sino-Japanese War took place, which resulted in a decisive victory on the part of the more technologically advanced Japanese, the losses incurred to the Chinese government, as well as it demonstrating the Qing dynasty's lack of modern weaponry and tactics, allowing the European colonial powers the opportunity to carve up the wider Chinese nation among themselves, forcing the 99-year lease of Kowloon Bay on the Yellow Sea to the German Empire, a 25-year lease of Port Arthur to the Russian Empire, which would later be contested during the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, and the 99-year lease of Kwangchu-Wan to France. Due to the presence of Russia on the Chinese mainland, having already suffered a bloody conflict with the Tsarist government during the Crimean War of the 1850s, the British Empire pressured the Qing Empire into leasing Weihai Wei on the Yellow Sea during March 1898, followed 3 months later, in the wake of France's expansion into China, by the signing of the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory in Peking, which gave the British full jurisdiction of newly acquired land, which covered approximately 200 miles surrounding Hong Kong, known as the New Territories region. The 99-year lease on Hong Kong set to expire on June 30th, 1997, although the Kowloon Walled City would remain an asset of the Qing dynasty and answerable to the government in Peking. As for the Walled City itself, by the time Britain had signed its 99-year lease on Hong Kong and the New Territories, the fortress had been evolved to take on a less defensive role and more an administrative one, with the Kwangtung Provincial Customs Station being established in 1871 in order to halt the pervasive opium smuggling business that was being perpetrated by the triads, this being replaced in 1886 by the Chinese Maritime Customs Station, while in 1875 a 700-foot launch was created from the fortress into the sea known as the Lung Chin Jetty, although after years of disrupting the natural water flows and thus causing a localized silt bank to form, the jetty was repaired in 1892 and extended by another 260 feet into Kowloon Harbour, following donations from local shopkeepers at a cost of $1,700, or $53,700 in 2022. Inside the walls itself, the functions of the fort remained entirely military, with no shops or other commercial services present, although along the eastern gate, a long cluster of shops ran down Kowloon Street for a quarter of a mile between the walled city and the waterfront, resulting in an increasingly prosperous market town that served the regions of the New Territories rather than specifically the garrison, with the Kaifeng Association established in 1880 as a charity that helped to organize public functions such as health, safety and good order, as well as using its strong social and economic influence to help contribute to free education and free medicine for impoverished farming groups that had chosen to find a new life in the city. By the end of the century, the biggest threat to Hong Kong and indeed the New Territories were groups of pirates who would frequently hijack foreign cargo ships, as was the case of the British steamship SS Nammoa in 1890, which, while inbound from Singapore to Hong Kong, was seized by pirates and the vessel's complement of passengers and crew crammed into a tiny salon in inhumane conditions, the vessel eventually being retaken by both British and Imperial officials, the latter of whom put their share of the prisoners to death by beheading, while figures such as the mysterious pirate queen, Lai Choi-san, would keep piracy in Hong Kong thriving well into the 20th century, even graduating to air piracy in 1948 with the hijacking of Cathay Pacific boat plane Miss Macau, becoming the first commercial airliner ever to be hijacked. In 1899, another major change came to the walled city when, following a strong Chinese insistence on retaining jurisdiction in the garrison, the British agreed to include a clause that within the city of Kowloon, Chinese officials would continue to exercise jurisdiction except so far as may be inconsistent with the military requirement to the defence of Hong Kong, a move which upset many sectors of the British interest, mostly foreign residents, who saw the addition of this clause as placing a Chinese enclave in the heart of a British-administered territory, and thus raising a major security concern. The matter continued to escalate, though, and in April of the same year, amid rumours that Qing soldiers were massing within the fort, the Hong Kong government, facing a strong resistance to occupy the new territories by the garrison, sent 600 men into the Kowloon Walled City under the command of the Governor-General of Kwangtung and Guangxi and the British authorities, threatening to starve out the garrison if they did not abandon their posts and vacate the city, eventually leading, on May 16th, to a full occupation by 300 men of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and 100 Hong Kong volunteers, who captured the city with little opposition, before ordering all Chinese civil and military officials to depart. The occupation of the Kowloon Walled City made legal through an order in council issued in December 1899, which stated that the city was to be administered in the same manner as the rest of the colony, though this was never recognised by the Peking government. Despite much talk of Chinese imperial factions retaking the Kowloon Walled City, political tensions reached a stalemate with no official administration established over the functions of the fort, leaving a power vacuum that was barely able to maintain authority within its walls, previous land ownership agreements being rendered void by the Hong Kong government, and instead replaced by 5-year leases. This short time period being a deliberate choice by the Hong Kong government due to the awkward political situation, the government in fact being reluctant to grant land leases for all but public functions, with the Protestant Church being a major beneficiary as it received several short-term leases to operate schools and charities in the city. While certain sections of the former fortress were revitalised into civic uses, other areas fell rapidly into decay, as was the case with the South Wall and what was once the Commodore's opulent office building, which had been briefly used as a plague hospital during the early 1900s before being left to rack and ruin by the mid-1920s, the continued deterioration of around 60 former domestic dwellings, meaning that, by the turn of the 1930s, large portions of the walled city had returned to nature, and were overrun by vegetable gardens, pig farms and traditional crafts, the area becoming something of a tourist attraction for foreign visitors during the latter half of the decade, with Chinese guidebooks praising its nostalgic and historical significance. Beyond the walls of the city, as it did not suffer the same administrative deadlock, the wider Kowloon expanded rapidly throughout the 1910s and into the 1920s, with huge land reclamation projects seeing large swathes of the harbour being infilled for use by tenement housing, shops and factories, leaving the walled city, which once stood on the waterfront, high and dry by 1930, with only the very end of the Lung Chin jetty left for use by ferries across to Hong Kong Island, the former Chinese Maritime Customs Station being employed briefly as a police station between 1899 and 1920, before the police office was moved to a new dedicated structure on the harbour edge. With its role as a fort long behind it, the former cannons that lined the tops of the walled city were looted by British salvagers who sold most of them to metal dealers for scrap, while 2 were displayed outside the new Water Police Station and 4 outside the new Kowloon City Police Station, the 2 remaining cannons being abandoned near the former South Gate and would remain in a ruined state and later buried by further development, until they were rediscovered in 1993, restored and remounted within the park that now occupies the site of the former walled city. As for the city itself, a lack of coordination as to its development meant its conditions languished rapidly, with squatters filtering in steadily between its capture by the British in 1899 and the beginning of the 1930s, until by 1933 a population of 500 people called the walled city their home, its unsanitary conditions being a blessing in comparison to the overcrowded tenements found elsewhere in the Crown Colony. Although during that same year, the Hong Kong government announced that, for ostensibly sanitary reasons, all original structures with the exception of the public buildings would be torn down and replaced by a resort, with protests by residents in the Chinese government, who even appealed to the British for intervention, falling on deaf ears, the only buildings left standing within the walled city by 1940 being an old people's home, the former Lung Chin communal school, and the private home of a native resident. The real looting of the walled city, however, wouldn't begin until the onset of World War II in the Far East on December 8, 1941, where, only hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese artillery commenced its bombardment of the new territories and later Hong Kong Island itself, the garrison of 14,500 troops stationed within the British Crown colony, comprising troops from the UK itself, Commonwealth factions from India and Canada, Free French, and forces loyal to the government of China, who had fled the mainland during the Second Sino-Japanese War, putting up a strong but ultimately futile resistance against the far larger 29,700-man force of the Japanese Empire. The battle eventually coming to an end on Christmas Day 1941, when Governor Mark Young and General Christopher Maltby surrendered to General Takashi Sakai at 3:30 in the afternoon, ceding the entire colony to the control of Japan. From the initial losses incurred by the British and Commonwealth forces during the battle, a brutal regime of violence and oppression would grip Hong Kong for the next 3 years and 8 months, with up to 10,000 civilians arbitrarily executed by Japanese soldiers, while thousands more were tortured, raped or mutilated. The occupying forces severely rationing food supplies within the city, including necessities such as rice, oil, flour, salt and sugar, leading to a famine that caused hundreds more to die of starvation. Due to its location, Hong Kong, for the Japanese, was vitally important in terms of allowing for airstrikes to be conducted against Allied land forces and naval operations across Southeast Asia, and thus began a rapid expansion of the Hong Kong Kai Tak airfield, which was situated on the shores of Kowloon Harbour and had been established in 1924 as a private aerodrome and later a base for the Royal Air Force, the occupying forces requiring runway extensions and expanded facilities in order to service their fleet of fighters, including the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, and heavy bombers such as the Mitsubishi G-4M Betty. To source the materials necessary to extend the runways and reclaim land out in Kowloon Harbour, the ancient walled city was stripped of what few surviving pieces remained of its original fortified structure, the granite ashlar facing being demolished completely in order to provide bedrock for the runways, and the Lung Seon stone bridge, together with its impressive pavilion, was swept away in order to provide apron space. Other ancient historic relics destroyed by the Japanese in order to expand Kai Tak Airport, including the Song Wong Toi, a large boulder which, upon the toppling of the Song dynasty in 1279 by the Yuan dynasty, was used as a memorial to the last 2 boy emperors of the southern Song dynasty, Zhao Shi and Zhao Bing, having the words Sung Won Toi, or translated, Terrace of the Sung Kings, carved onto its facade, the ancient stone being broken up with dynamite, and the hill on which it was perched levelled to provide additional aircraft parking. While the Japanese were eventually ousted from Hong Kong following their surrender on August 15, 1945, the damage left in their wake, both physically and culturally, would linger for decades, and while the walled city had essentially been reduced to rubble, its former footprint was resettled by up to 2,000 refugees, escaping the wider Chinese Civil War by 1947. The Hong Kong government's attempt to expel the squatters provoking yet another public backlash and diplomatic situation, as the re-established Chinese government wanted to reclaim the walled city as its own territory, following the drafting of an outline plan in November 1946 by the nationalist Chinese state, which would see the area redeveloped to include an administration office, schools, and its own police force, as well as other functions, the British governor, Sir Alexander Grantham, ultimately being forced to directly intervene by way of a hands-off policy towards the running of the city, essentially leaving it to its own devices. From what little remained of the original city at the end of World War II, which comprised solely the empty shell of the former administrative office known as the Mandarin House, an unregulated urban sprawl built to no formal structural codes spread rapidly across the footprint of the fortress, and within a decade had already established itself as a lawless dive occupied by heroin addicts, illegal gambling dens, brothels and prostitution rackets, which conducted themselves without any fear of legal intervention, there being no tax, no business regulations, no health or planning systems, and no police presence. Front and centre of the walled city were the ever-present triad crime syndicates, of which 5 gangs would eventually call the area home: the King Yi, the Sun Yi On, 14K, the Wo Xing Wo, and the Dai Ho Choi, allowing them to conduct a highly lucrative narcotics business that saw opium and heroin manufactured and smuggled out across the world with impunity, an ironic turnaround considering the previous function of the fort as a main customs checkpoint used to stem the drug trade. Beyond the organised crime elements of the walled city, the area was also a magnet for up-and-coming entrepreneurs due to the low rents offered by private landlords, who saw a unique opportunity to establish hundreds of sweatshop factories within its congested, tightly packed streets, with production lines often manned by entire families, creating incredible profits and massive productivity, while the working conditions were beyond appalling. goods output from within the confines of the walled city being distributed across the globe, including plastics and textile manufacturing that was sold in the West by either oblivious or ignorant corporations. Food production, including dumplings and fish balls, also being a mainstay of the city's economy, often being served up at luxury 5-star restaurants across the wider Kowloon and Hong Kong region. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the modern walled city was its architecture, which, as mentioned, was built to no codes and no safety specification. The skyscrapers that would come to define the external appearance of this enclave being erected simply out of what materials could be salvaged, with thin columns, built on foundations of concrete, poured into shallow trenches, supporting hastily built prefabricated tenements that were stacked atop one another and climbed to a height only limited by the presence of the famous banked flight path on approach to runway 13 at the nearby Kai Tak Airport, subsidence and settlement being a common occurrence that would result in one high-rise leaning up against another, eventually leading to the walled city becoming essentially one single self-supporting structure. Behind its facade of toppling tenement blocks, the area was crisscrossed by dozens of claustrophobic hallways that were dark, congested and impossible to navigate, leading aimlessly and without consistency between one area and the next, with many obscure dead ends and wandering loops, these rambling prisons filled with thousands of people who lived, worked, built, traded and learned among the dirt, criminals, addicts and prostitutes, all while the sun, blocked out by the proximity of the buildings to one another, left many areas in perpetual night. This isn't to say that the walled city was completely ungoverned, as among the many squatters and refugees who called its Stygian passageways home, a form of self-administration was established gradually throughout the 1950s, leading, in 1963, to the Hong Kong authorities finally intervening within the city for the first time in over a decade, issuing a demolition order for one corner of the city and a relocation of its residents to a new housing commission located nearby, although this was again confronted by stiff opposition, and an anti-demolition committee was formed which stymied plans to redevelop the space. However, with political connections now formed between the Hong Kong government and the self-established administration of the walled city, younger residents, primarily families with children, appealed to the Royal Hong Kong Police to conduct raids against the still-present Triad influence and its incredibly profitable narcotics operations, the first moves against these criminal elements commencing between 1973 and 1974, when over 3,500 police raids were undertaken, resulting in 2,500 arrests and the seizing of over £4,000 of drugs, continued monitoring by the police, and the loss of the perceived immunity the Triads had once enjoyed in the walled city, meaning that by 1983, organised crime within the area had been reduced to an acceptable level, although crimes such as prostitution, illegal gambling, small-scale drug dealing and usage, sweatshops and modern slavery, muggings, common assault and murder were still just as rampant. In the end, despite something of a harmonious coexistence being found among the residents of the walled city, the conditions remained completely unsanitary, and the toppling tenement structures deemed to be of such an informal construction that they would never be considered sound, and thus, on January 14, 1987, 400 officials from the Hong Kong Housing Department erected cordons around the 83 streets and alleys leading into and out of the walled city, before entering its enigmatic interior, conducting a survey that, for the first time, would establish the population of the walled city's residents, with the approximate full-time occupancy of the city being 33,000 people, although at any time this could have been pushed to 50,000 due to an unknown number of temporary or transiting residents. In light of the declaration of December 19, 1984, in which the British government formally agreed to transfer sovereignty of Hong Kong to China on July 1, 1997, secret plans had been developed to evict all residents and clear the Kowloon Walled City, while in order to avoid erroneous or fraudulent compensation claims being made to the Hong Kong government by residents during the eviction process, the Housing Department kept the area under surveillance for 6 months in order to establish the full-time population of the site, the compensation package for residents and business owners totaling $2.76 billion, with residents receiving, on average, $380,000 for their individual flats, while negotiations, which progressed over the course of several years, eventually resulted in there being only 457 individual households still unwilling to accept the terms of the eviction notice by 1992, a majority of the 33,000 residents of the site having moved on by this point. In the end, on July 2nd of that year, the final residents were forcibly evicted from their homes by the Royal Hong Kong Police riot squad, and a tall wire fence was erected to encircle the whole site along what was essentially the former footprint of the original granite wall of the fortress, a ceremonial first swing of the Wrecker's Ball taking place on March 23, 1993, although actual disassembly of the walled city would be done in a much slower and more methodical manner, the final remnants of the disjointed and cumbersome post-war Kowloon Walled City being removed almost exactly a year after demolition had started. As part of the original redevelopment scheme, the former site of the walled city would be converted into a landscape park, while during the demolition process, remnants of the ancient wall, together with structures such as the former Mandarin House and some of the old fortress cannons, were unearthed, and from the squalor of what had come before, a year's work and conversion resulted, on December 22, 1995, in the dedication of the Kowloon Walled City Park, which was modelled on the famous 17th century Zhangyang Gardens built by the Qing dynasty. This haven of peace, sited squarely in the heart of bustling Kowloon, finally realising the dream of turning the old fortress into a resort, as envisaged back in the 1930s. Today, the Kowloon Walled City is remembered less for its long and turbulent history as a political football kicked between the influence of the British Empire and the Qing dynasty, and more for its 6 decades spent as a rotting slum which marred the face of downtown Kowloon, a cluster of tumbling, disorganised buildings that had become an enclave of crime and depravity, an embarrassment for Hong Kong as it attempted to move away from the dark times of its occupation under the Japanese. However, as was uncovered during the demolition of the squalid tenements, there is far more to the history of this incredible place just beneath the surface, and a nostalgic sentiment can be found for all aspects of the city's story, either as the great fortress that once stood as a sign of Chinese defiance against the colonial British, or as a dark and gloomy megastructure that seemed to take on a life of its own, such as the amazing legacy of Kowloon's infamous walled city.